Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 4th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. Yes, we are on the eve of Election Day here in the United States, but we are not going to talk about that this week, partially because we have no idea what's going to happen, and partially because it's freaking me out and I'd rather change the subject. So we will dive into this week's episode in just a moment. But first, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep this train on the tracks is through support from audience members just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Rebecca Davis. She is a professor of history and of women and gender studies at the University of Delaware, and she has a new book out. It's called Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Rebecca L. Davis. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on your show.
I am excited to talk about your newest book, Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. But before we get into the book itself and the work that you did to kind of put this out, as usual on my show, I want to get to know you a little bit better. So let's just start with your role right now. So you're a professor of history and of women and gender studies. And is that because you tend to focus on the history of women and gender, and those are the two sort of departments where that type of work might fall?
Oh, yeah. So I was hired about 18 years ago by the Department of History and was trained as a historian, undergrad and graduate, all as a historian. And one of the things I was hired to teach at the University of Delaware was an undergraduate course in the history of sexuality in America. And so I started that my very first semester there, I started teaching that. And I always had what they, I guess, call a courtesy appointment in women and gender studies. So I cross-listed a bunch of my classes and supported the department's events and so on. But about a year ago, I asked the dean if I could move 25% of my line from history to women and gender studies to make it officially a joint appointment. And my reasons for doing so were primarily that nationally, women and gender studies is increasingly embattled. And there are all kinds of, not at the University of Delaware, I want to be clear, but broadly speaking, there are a lot of states where they're banning or shutting down those departments and so on. And at our university, it's a small department that did not have many full professors. And I had recently been promoted to full professor. So I thought, this is a way I can, without really changing a whole lot about my day-to-day in the university, be a full professor who is now officially in both of these departments. And as a result of that shift, I also am developing a new course that will be a women and gender studies owned course called Sexual Health and History, which I'll teach for the first time in the spring. More interdisciplinary. I mean, so history falls within women and gender studies, but like everything that ends in the word studies, that means that it's really interdisciplinary. There are anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, people who study literature and so on, who are affiliated with women and gender studies. So my course for them will include a lot of history because that's how my brain works, but also engage a lot of other topics as well.
And so when we think about something as broad, I mean, it's such a funny thing to think about, like women and gender studies. Like to me, that's like being like peopling. Like, it's like, how do you even know? Like, what are the foci when you're developing curriculum and when you're thinking about the different types of coursework and um, and even research as well, right? Like the scholarship. Is it about particular individuals? Is it about cultural dynamics? Is it international? Is it domestic? Wow, there's so much.
In a very pragmatic response to your question, I think many women and gender studies departments have some area of specialization. Our department has long had expertise in domestic and gender-based violence prevention work, and in a variety of for undergraduate study and for other and for research support and so on. Um, but I mean, often people find their way to women and gender studies through other disciplines. So they may have trained, they might not have gotten a PhD in women and gender studies. They might have gotten a PhD somewhere else. And the place that was hiring or the place that understood what they were doing best and recognized the value and wanted them teaching its courses was women and gender studies. And so like our major has foundational courses in like feminist theory, and approaches to women and gender studies. It's inherently interdisciplinary, so students are going to learn all these different ways of thinking about gender and how it works. I mean, so the whole idea of it starts in the 1970s. It's an outgrowth of the women's movement. To even no universities had a class on women's history in the 1950s or 60s. Maybe Wellesley did. I'm not being flippant. I think like maybe a few select women's colleges would have had those courses. I don't know for sure, but certainly the University of Delaware didn't.
And to be clear, like they all had history departments and they all had history courses. And even though they were just called history, those were like what? I mean, I'm going to throw a number out there, 90 to 95% men's history.
Oh, totally. And that might be a conservative number because even there was one tenured woman in the history department at UD prior to in the 1970s, and she didn't teach women's history because to be recognized by your peers as a serious historian, it was very risky to do women's history. And so it began as sort of a social movement. There were some professors, graduate students who even would offer a non-credit off-campus women's history class, with mimeographed packets of readings, and then petitioned colleges and universities to start, demanding that they offer women's history moving forward. And what that did, to be clear, is it's not like suddenly we talk about the first ladies when we talk about the history of the presidency, although that's certainly part of it. It means classes that, whole approaches to thinking about history differently. So thinking about, if you're a scholar of class and labor relations, thinking about domestic labor, which most labor historians had never done. Thinking about childbirth as a historically specific phenomenon. Thinking about, bringing ideas about contraception into histories of medicine. It had been completely left out. So all kinds of just common sense topics that bear upon everyone's life had been omitted because there weren't different voices in the room asking different questions. And so that's where women's studies is has social justice origins. Same with Africana studies, ethnic studies, Native American studies. These are all areas of study today that originated and often continue in social justice traditions. So it's really in the 90s and early aughts that some departments begin to add gender to that department name, women and gender or gender and women. Some start to add sexuality. These are very political debates. People who had been part of the struggle in the 70s, some welcomed these changes. Some felt that it diminished what they had fought for. Because wait, now we're going to study masculinity. Wasn't that what everything was before we started studying women? Why would we want to have, gender studies, when we have fought so hard to just get attention to the lives and experiences of women, perspectives of women? I don't think there's much of that resistance anymore. I think there's a broad recognition of gender as a much wider concept that encompasses people of all genders, within which women's experiences are pretty distinctive. So So that's where you end up with these departments. I don't even remember what your original question was, but that's
It's
where I went.
exactly that. And it's funny because I'm identifying deeply because, I come from psychology. I'm a clinical psychologist, but I concentrated in social justice and diversity. And I took a lot of courses in like gender-based violence and in, LGBTQI affirming care. And like, I think there's probably so much crossover, but I'm like over in a psych department, So it's really interesting that the multidisciplinary aspect of it is becoming, I think, richer and richer in academia, but there is still this tradition of sort of departments and people with degrees in certain fields working in those departments. And so that movement towards marbling them together is, I think it's increasing with time. But something else comes up for me, and I'm curious about, I don't know, this feels like a very postmodern debate, but like this concept of women being, let's say, women and gender minorities being systematically erased or removed or kept out of historical conversations. And then this real movement starting in the 60s and 70s and moving forward, like you said, into the 90s, where we saw a little bit more of it becoming codified, of having a conversation held and making space specifically for that. In some ways, have you ever seen an argument or a concern that having it be sort of its own thing prevents it from integrating back into classical history? Like, what's your take on that sort of like, how do we get to a point where history includes women's history and we don't have to have a, quote, women's history, because history is women and men and every gender?
I know. I would see this playing out in real time in graduate school. I'd have friends who were putting together their lists of books that they needed to read for their qualifying exams. And we sometimes would just peek at each other's lists to get ideas. We each, did these independently. And I would look at a friend's list and be like, you're studying quote unquote American politics, and there is not a single book on here about the women's suffrage movement, about like the involvement of women in American political party work prior to them having the vote. Like how there's no book here that uses gender as a category of analysis. And I'd had friends who said, does that matter? So, and this was like, the fight would go on. And I would see sometimes, I remember very vividly during a graduate seminar when I was a student, and one of these sort of more traditional male professors who did international history of like international relations, gave another one of these presentations that did not talk about gender or women at all. And the professor who was leading the class was a historian of women and gender. And she challenged him on this. And he sort of was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so she, it was about the Cold War, and she was which is full of gendered imagery. And she was really trying to bring home for him, like, don't you think when they're talking about, penetration and grabbing them by the balls, like, don't you think there's a gender analysis in the way that these, foreign policy experts are talking to each other about the threat of the Soviet Union? Because that kind of language was all over a lot of the foreign policy documents of the time.
Well, and it's clear to us that that is deeply gendered, but I worry that there's still, to this day in 2024, and I see examples of it literally daily, that the patriarchy is so invisible to so many people. It's the water that we swim in, and people are so unaware that it's just the air they breathe and the water they swim in, that they don't see that to be man is normative and to be women is other. And therefore we are now, oh, but why are you bringing up other? I'm just talking about the war, and the war is men, and that's normative. They don't even have that level of understanding. It's not like I'm trying to add women to the conversation. They were always freaking there. Yeah.
I think that that's how I approach the history of sexuality too, that I just see sexual politics all around me. It's what I've always been living with and responding to. And sort of the whole question of who's setting the terms of the conversation matters in the questions that we ask. I will say that the experiences I had in graduate school were vastly different than the experiences that my mentors had in graduate school. A great deal has changed as a result of the women's movement, of LGBTQ movements, of new ways of approaching ideas about race and power. All of that has really changed what's possible in the academy. But yeah, I mean, I do think that someone who's doing history like I'm doing is often in the position of explaining the relevance of their work. I will say that in the last 4 or 5 years, no one has asked me why the history of sexuality matters, because I think we're living through such a crisis in sexual autonomy, gender autonomy, that the stakes of this could not be clearer. And I also think that things like the Me Too movement, which was enormously imperfect, drew more attention to just what you were saying, like the waters that women and non-cis male people swim in, than I think anything I had seen before or knew about historically, very differently even than the women's movement of the 1970s, only because of social media, right? So the reach of the Me Too conversation, I think, was in some ways much wider. So that's a hard thing to do. I don't know that we ever get to the place where it's, we've fully educated everyone, and I think we all have things that we don't notice and that other people need to point out to us, though. I think that white privilege is one of the waters that I swim in, and I learn and continue to try to educate myself and continue to try to apologize for my mistakes and make sure not to make them again, and becoming more aware of that in my own life, because it's definitely was never something that was taught to me. No one in my childhood or my education at any point was like, you have all of this privilege. That wasn't part of my education. It's something I really needed urgently to figure out as an adult, and have tried to. But I do think maybe we're getting to a place where more people who have sort of gender privilege are more aware of it. I'm not really, I like to hope so.
I think that it's a dual thing that happens, right? Where there is more and more awareness, and you start to see, like, I'm seeing many more like feminist men, and I'm seeing many more individuals in my life who are doing the reflective work that probably a generation or two ago wouldn't have. But I'm also seeing in some ways more pernicious divides and pushback. Like, I think when it's implicit that the patriarchy is a system of power, and when that implicit power is just felt by all men, then you don't have a lot of men needing to do the work. But the minute that it becomes explicit and then there's a threat of that power being taken away, I think that you do see a small but very vocal minority of like male supremacists, basically, of misogynists who are like, wow, you said the quiet part out loud. Like, and I think you're seeing that little sliver is almost in some ways more pernicious than it was.
Yeah, the sort of Jordan Peterson of it all has really been quite something to observe.
And I'm glad that you said Jordan Peterson too, because I think a lot of people, they see him as more mainstream, and they see him as more like, quote, balanced, which blows my mind. Like, you didn't say like the, oh God, what's his name? The Florida guy. Like, there's examples that are so atrocious, and he is also deeply atrocious, but for some reason, because of the sheen of like respectability, because of the titles, because of whatever, those messages are coming through in like an authoritative way that they aren't as critically grappled with by the audience.
Right. And I think that he also is really good at word salad. So I think that there's, on the one hand, I don't want to give him too much oxygen, but he's not actually saying much that makes sense. And I think that that's part of, for people who want to think that their biases have scholarly rigor behind them, he provides that, he provides like a mask of legitimacy to things that are really nonsense. And, much of what he's saying is either completely debunked, or if you read it carefully, it doesn't make any sense. So there's some of us who've had just sort of inherent experiences of the ways that gender and sexuality shape our lives, shape the world around us, shape our opportunities and everything. But the other thing that I really love to study and teach about is that how much historical change there is in that situation, that what we're facing today is not part of some inevitable historical construct, and that even things like the patriarchy as a concept is plastic, right? That it doesn't mean that word doesn't connect to the same systems of oppression or the same ideals across all space and time. So that we can, and this gets a little tricky when dealing with LGBTQ history, because there is such a need for finding ancestors and finding continuity. And I think that, and I honor that and understand that. But what it meant to desire someone of the same sex or outside of a sort of marital reproductive framework 400 or 500 years ago is not at all how it manifests or what it means to people today. So I like to talk about, I would absolutely agree that gender nonconformity and what we would today call queer desires, those are obviously sort of timeless. And I say obviously because every time archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians go looking for them, they find them. They are there. But what those sorts of expressions of gender or expressions of desire meant and how they manifested have really dramatically changed. And that's where I see, where I sort of approach ideas like patriarchy, is to think about it as itself a historical creation, which means that we're not stuck with it, right? It mutates and it adapts and it's pernicious, but it's not inevitable. And in fact, our ways of thinking about bodies and autonomy and pleasure have really changed over time. And that's, because the topic can get, the things that I write about in my book and that I teach my students can pretty quickly get kind of grim because, I warn my student, there's this whole thing about doing like a content warning before you talk or write about violence and things of this nature. And I think that's important. And I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, I'm like, there's like a blanket content warning for this course. I'm teaching you the history of sexuality in America. It's gonna get bad. And I'm gonna try to cue you before that happens. If you need to get up, walk away, like totally fine. But I can't content warning, like it might just be in answering somebody's question that I have to bring up some sort of difficult topic.
Right. And the students have to kind of, sadly, unfortunately, regulate themselves throughout they need to know when it's time to stand up and walk away, when it's time to take a break. And you make them feel safe to do that.
I hope so. I try to. But I think that, at the same time, like the way that violence has played out is, I think, and my understanding of the history is not because of some invariable, inescapable violence within men that causes them to do
right. Exactly.
things.
No,
This
is culturally reinforced.
This is culturally reinforced, and it's culturally specific. It is so there's like really interesting, complicated stuff in the way that we come to understand indigenous North American societies before the arrivals of Europeans who described what they saw, or in the process of first encountering Europeans who described what they saw. These the indigenous nations that were present in North America were not literate, like not writing cultures. So we have archaeology, we have anthropology, we have oral traditions, and we have the observations of these Europeanists who often did not understand what they were seeing to try to figure out what was going on. And so, one of the questions that comes up is there were systems of captivity. And sometimes it was like women who were given as gifts as part of diplomatic trades, as part of peace negotiations. And there were also Europeans who said, all of these, Native men, they treat their wives like sex workers and will just like give them to us for the night. And then the women ask for payment in the morning. And so to their eyes, this was prostitution to the European
Right.
eyes.
Because they were looking at their own cultural frame.
And so now, like, historians of this and people who then do this interdisciplinary work are like, that's actually the exact opposite. So these were cultures in which men did not own women's bodies. And so if a woman decided that she wanted to have sex with this new European guy, her husband really didn't have the ability to say no. But these were also exchange cultures. So she understood herself as valuable and giving a gift to this man. And so then he would owe her a gift in return. So completely different framework. And they would have observed what marriage looked like in Christian European societies as a real form of subjection of women, because the women weren't allowed to leave the marriages and had far fewer, were punished for premarital sex, which was not the case in most indigenous North American cultures.
And there was no recourse for like marital rape. Like that wasn't even thought of as a concept, right?
It's like, and the other thing that we find is when some of these European men were horrifically abusive, the indigenous women, there is this testimony, like they cried out, right? They recognized what was happening with these men as completely different from anything that happened in their own cultures that they'd grown up in. And so the sexual violence that came with Europe, it's not to say there was no sexual violence in indigenous North America, but there was something qualitatively different when that was brought with these ideas about male head of household, that women basically become property of their husbands with marriage. That brought different ideas about who controls women's bodies and who would have access to them. And then you, of course, factor in that they looked at darker skinned women and had different ideas about, different worth of people based upon their color and so on. So it's super complicated, but I just find that I can get really down studying this, and I know that it can easily become sort of a downer. But when I remember that, like, well, we made this, like, this isn't there, contrary to all the garbage from, the Jordan Petersons of the world, this is not written in our DNA. There is no masculine genetic directive that says that this is how men are and that this is how women are. There are obvious differences in people's bodies, right? Of our hormones and our chromosomes and all of these things. Some bodies do some things and some do others, and that's obvious and true. But what that means in terms of how we connect to each other, treat each other, that's history, right? That is what we make of these bodies and how we relate them to other people. There's like just heaps and heaps of evidence. I don't know why that story is harder to get into the mainstream. But I mean, with my book, I'm trying to, I really wanted to write it in a way that lots of people would find interesting. I really tried to avoid academic jargon. I don't talk about theory at all in the book. But I just had this sense of urgency of like, oh gosh, how do we get more people to know that, that history matters to how we think about sexual power and rights and queer, relationships and so on.
Yeah. And I don't think it's the only answer. And I know it was more of a rhetorical question, but I think one answer to the question of like why it's so hard to get this messaging or like why it doesn't seem to gain traction is because there's a system in place that doesn't want to hear this. I think that, part of the reason that the patriarchy works is that there's messaging that these are essentialist features, that men are essentially, by their nature, superior in certain ways, and that women are essentially, by their nature, inferior in certain ways. And that if we start to peel the layers back and expose the fact that we as a society have successfully, quote, feminized fundamental human experiences like empathy and compassion and caretaking, and we have that layer of having feminized those things, we match that feminization with less than or not desirable. And then we masculinize other features like not showing your emotions or being physically strong or being able to overpower something. And we label that as being superior then all of a sudden we can just say, no, but that's how things always are and always will be. And the people who benefit from that are like, let's keep this train going on the tracks. And then you've got all of these people who have systematically been like disenfranchised by that, been disempowered by that, who are screaming, going, this is not how it is. But the sad thing is we still to this day do not have equal power in almost every social structure. And that becomes really hard when it's the person who is the vulnerable or the person who has been, whose power has been taken from them saying, no, but listen, like, why would they listen? Why would they listen to something that would not benefit them?
Right. I mean, what's sort of, or my brain goes and in these conversations is thinking back, well, how old are those ideas? And I think they're about 250 years old. I mean, it's really pretty recent. So if you were reading which we can do because they're in archives, the like spiritual journals of Puritan men in New England in the 1600s, they wrote passionately about being penetrated by God, by Christ. And they wrote about that they would become like the bride of Christ when they entered into communion into spiritual union with Christ. And they were totally comfortable and at ease with this language. It was about, because they thought of the soul as submissive. And so therefore, and they thought of women as more submissive, so that the soul then was feminine, which means that they understood that the part of them that connected most closely to God was feminine. This does not mean that they were, we cannot talk about them as being gay. It doesn't make any sense for their worldview. But they were very fluent in a gendered language that just has no relationship to this idea that, men are men and women are women and, that's it. And they looked upon sodomy as a violent sex act, particularly though they would define it as anal penetration. And almost the only times it was prosecuted, there were accusations that it was forcible. So all kinds of other male-male sex play, in other words, is not getting brought up for prosecution in colonial New England or the Chesapeake or anywhere else in the 1600s, 1700s. There were occasional trials of ministers who got there's a trial of a minister in like the 1760s in Connecticut. There's an earlier case of a guy who wasn't a minister. He was just like a wealthy guy in the town who finally was brought on trial for abusing young men who worked for him. But in the case of the guy who was accused of abusing the men who worked for him, it was non-consensual. And in the case of, the minister, it's the issue that it's non-marital, right? So there isn't so their ideas about, gender are both rooted in the idea that when British English common law, like when a man and a woman marry, they become one person and that person is the husband, right? That's the sort of English common law principle. And a married woman technically can't sign contracts, can't set up a new residence. She is always legally defined by the husband. Money she earns, unless there's some prior trust or agreement, is the husband's money, and so on. These same people recognize that if a guy had to sail back to England to deal with some business or politics, he'd be gone for months. And you can't leave the farm or the store behind with no one able to sign a contract. So women would move into this role of what they called like a deputy husband. And so she would have this sort of more flexible role, more authority that the community recognized. Oh, she's acting as the husband now. She's not a woman who's got new rights, but she is, when she's doing these things on behalf of her husband, doing so legitimately because she's doing so on his behalf. She wouldn't have been able to go and cast a vote, by the time that we get into voting, which is later. But so there's both. So it's also that even as their systems are different, their systems are internally contradictory. And that we also see over and over again, that it's never it's not the case that patriarchy that we, as we understand it today, is what existed 400 years ago. And it's also not the case that 400 years ago, everybody agreed on what men should do and women should do. And the same person might change their mind depending upon the situation. So that's when I get excited about studying this history, is just thinking about all of this is so variable, right? There are so many different ways of doing this. There are so many changes that have happened over time, so that we, so another example is there's a new film out, a documentary I really want to see about Abraham Lincoln called Lover of Men, about his same-sex relationships. And they make a real point of I was listening to an interview with them, the filmmakers, of saying, we're not here to say that Abe Lincoln was gay or bisexual, because that's the wrong question. The question is, what did it mean for Abe Lincoln in the early 19th century to grow up in a culture in which the expression of love, including physical affection between men, was not considered at all abnormal? And what opportunities did that open up to him to have these close, emotionally bonded relationships with men? I was thrilled to hear that that's how they've done this documentary, because that's how historians of sexuality have been talking about it for a really long time. I asked my students, what words would you use now that you've read letters that a young Abraham Lincoln sent to his best friend, Joshua Speed? And they are very loving letters, and they do talk about physical affection. And some of the students come up, say, like homosexual, gay, bisexual, queer, and others are just like, feel like none of these words work, because, so that's the other thing approaching ideas like patriarchy, women's history, whatever, is that we can both see a history that gets us to where we are today. At the same time, when we're studying the history, we need to try to understand what the people at that time thought it meant. So if it helps somebody who's feeling alone in the world to think about Abe Lincoln as a bi ancestor, I encourage them to do so. I don't think there's any problem with that. I would just say, let's also imagine a world in which no one cares if anyone's bi, because everybody's sort of free to show affection to whomever they like, as long as they're not getting anybody pregnant out of marriage, which was the concern at the time. The concern wasn't men having sex with men. It was premarital pregnancy.
Right.
So,
like there's obviously, it's very hard to get outside of your own frame and your own zeitgeist, because that is sort of the parameter through which you view everything. But it does sound also like what I'm hearing is that part of the job of a historian, and especially a historian who then is translating these insights for sort of public consumption, is that there is a zeitgeist, right? At any given moment in history, there are cultural norms, there are ways of thinking and ways of being that people have because the society that they're in are reinforcing that those ways of thinking and being are the shoulds or the normative things. And at the same time, there are all different people thinking all different things within that culture. And I think that's something I'm often reminded of when, like, let's say you're talking to your own ancestors, you're talking to your own parents or your own, and they're making excuses, or you're talking to somebody about, oh, this is how my grandpa was. Well, but they didn't really know at the time. And, everybody was kind of racist. No, they weren't. It was more socially acceptable to be racist in the South, in, these certain eras. It was more socially acceptable to say those words out loud. But there were always people who were observing and experiencing that and saying, this is not okay. And I don't want it to be this way. And I think we forget that. We think that every actor within a zeitgeist thinks the way that the zeitgeist, cultivates. And that is not true.
right. And there are some, I love teaching about the 1800s, the 19th century, because I think it's the real transition moment for this history of sexuality in America. Even sort of like 1850 to 1950 is sort of, it's the second, the book has 3 parts, and that's the second part, the sort of hinge of the book. And, one of the things that we see happening, during the 19th century are different ways of talking about what kinds of sexual relationships are okay. So, for example, there are a whole bunch of religious revivals and new religious movements. And so you have these new sex reformers coming about. The first sex educators really in the United States are starting in the 1820s, publishing guides to sexual anatomy and so on in the 1830s. It's risky to do, but there are people now starting to do this, and the books go through multiple printings. So people want this knowledge. They're very concerned about whether or not masturbation might be bad for people's health. So there's a lot of warnings about the solitary vice, and concern about young men and young women getting into trouble. And a lot of the folks who are most sort of strict about this are coming at it from a sort of religious Protestant mindset. Like, this is sinful behavior, and then sin is therefore also unhealthy. They're trying to merge the medical and the religious.
Oh, is that when you're seeing things like, hairy palms and drooling and like a lot of the rhetoric around
consumption,
right?
Onanism will, yes, insanity, so on. Yeah. So, but at the same time, there were more sex workers employed in America than probably at any other time in history. So, and there was a whole new culture of men's publications. They were usually really cheap newspapers, and that had kind of raunchy cartoons in them with lots of sexual puns, would have articles describing the reporter's most recent visit to the most stylish brothel, and would give the address of it as part of the story so that anybody interested could also go check it out. Sex workers in New York City in 1830s and onward were sort of locally known characters who would often be featured and talked about in these newspapers, and they would also.
Oh, so was it more mainstream, or was it still like a counterculture?
Well, I guess that's the whole question, right? Is like, what do we describe as the mainstream versus what do we say is the counterculture? And this sexual culture, this very public male-centered sexual culture, really takes shape in that period in the mid-19th century, in ways. So, and as a very sort of crude contrast, an almanac from the 1700s, which covered all kinds of things in addition to aphorisms and the weather, might have poems about lusty women that would kind of make fun of that widow who's going after every single guy who comes onto her farm, in ways that involved women and men in on the joke, that weren't. It wasn't assumed that the reader of that almanac was male. By the time we get to like the 1830s, 1840s, these are really targeted to young men. And the women who appear in these publications are typically sex workers. And at the time, being an actress was also not considered a respectable employment. So there's this whole sort of the theater world, the bar room world. A woman who was in a bar, unless she owned the place with her husband or something, people would assume that she was a sex worker or sex worker adjacent. So these were about, same with gambling dens, prize fighting. All of these were places for men who were employed in legit employments in the city to then go and engage in sort of illicit forms of leisure. And, so that is happening at the same time that you have Sylvester Graham and these other reformers giving these lectures about, health reform and the dangers of masturbation. And in fact, these cultures collide. So often in the 1830s, Graham got run out of town. There would literally be like mobs of armed men who would storm his lectures, especially when he was talking about women. Or to women about women's need to also control their sexual appetite. Sometimes it was women's rights reformers who had invited him to come give this lecture to help educate other women about, anatomy and reproduction, and they had to like sneak him out a back door so he didn't get murdered. And so, which is interesting, right? but it's almost as if these young men who would storm these lectures by health reformers were saying, don't you change the narrative. Like this is our narrative. Like we're claiming sex and women's relationship to sex. And we're determining what that'll mean to women, and what it'll mean to us. And we don't want you coming in here and disturbing things. So it's really hard to say, like, what's the, and then there were secular reformers opposed to the religious reformers. And in the midst of this, we find that, all assumptions and sort of stereotypes to the contrary, a lot of very affectionate sexual relationships between husbands and wives, and a whole other narrative about, married couples finding pleasure in sex with each other, and sort of romantic love as sort of another way that people talked to one another about sex. There's a brand new book out about how working class people, spoke about sex with each other. I'm getting way off topic, but
I love it. It's my favorite thing in the world.
I just, when I researching and writing this book, that was the challenge, is that there are so many threads and there are so many different stories that get to what it is I was trying to show in the book, that these are issues that have mattered to people for hundreds of years. But the ways in which they mattered, the meanings people found in them, and the way that we think of identity has changed dramatically. And so that's where we can really find differences and see change.
And so how did you even choose the constraints? Like when you sat down to write this, did you always know, okay, I want it to be specific to America. I want it to be specific from, this year to this year. And I want to break it down in such a way that we can sort of see the way that these themes are recapitulated, but also like reinterpreted throughout this chronology. Like, how did you pick that? Because obviously there's too much. There's just too much, right? And you've got to figure out what you're going to present and what you're going to work with. And part of that is by choosing your own constraints.
Absolutely. So I was working with an editor at Norton who was really interested in a book that would have more or less the parameters that this one does. There's another book that was first published in 1988 called Intimate Matters, A History of Sexuality in America. Fabulous book. And at the time, it's co-authored by historians John D'Amelio and Estelle Friedman. And they were able in the 1980s to go read everything that was written.
Isn't that crazy?
Right? Like, because there was, and they combed, because it's like the most richly documented book. Like there's so much evidence, there's so many citations, and it's an amazing resource. And it really gave us a framework for thinking about their view that we kind of went from a marriage-based system to a more individual-based system of sexuality. That's one of a few sort of arcs in their book. And they updated it chronologically with subsequent chapters, but that broad arc remained in their book. And so the idea for this book was to not just update it, but to rethink what a single volume history of sex and sexuality in America might look like. What it would need to do. And so I wanted to, for one thing, just thanks in large part to that book, there is so much more scholarship today. It's not possible to put it all in one. It's just not, it's vast.
It's kind of the case across a lot of fields that you can look back to dissertations, however many years ago, depending on the field, and be like, that is a comprehensive review of the literature. It literally includes every citation that existed. That's not possible at all unless you work in a burgeoning field right now. There's just too much literature.
There's too much. So trying to think about what the parameters would be, I stuck to a very similar chronology as Intimate Matters, though obviously going closer to our, their book stopped around 2000 or 2010 or something. So that was a little bit different. But more is that we know a whole lot more about the history of sexuality in relation to people of color, in relationship to slavery, conquest, imperialism. We know a whole lot more about trans history, new ways of thinking about what it means to bring histories of race making and of sexuality into conversation with each other. So in what ways do the way that, so one of the arguments I try to make in the book is that it's not just at a certain point people started to think of themselves as having a sexual identity versus just having desires that are expressed in different ways, but having your sexuality be this distinctive part of who you are. But that prior to that, Americans were already assigning sexual identities to certain groups of people. And so, we were already telling, enslaved people, this is what you are like sexually. And we were, white people were coming and telling indigenous people, this is your sexuality, like with that example I gave earlier, and had all kinds of fantasies about what the sexual desires and availability of people from, Asian, parts of the world would have, and so on. And I wanted to emphasize that more. I wanted to put more stories about people of color at the center of the narrative, because the whole idea that there's a center and a margins is really flawed. Because what does that even mean to say that somebody's at the margin? They're not marginal to themselves.
Right. Or their family or their community.
Or their family, their community. Like that, that's just a different center. And so recentering, like if each chapter is like a spotlight shown down on like a particular moment in this history, I wanted to make sure that the spotlight was moving around a lot and wasn't always looking at the person standing, stage, whatever, center stage or whatever. I'm not a theater person. So moving beyond center stage. And so, that was important to me too. And that was another reason to try to write this book. For me though, too, I'll be honest, like I was incredibly passionate about this book, not only because I thought it would be fun to write and like exciting to write, but because I feel such a sense of urgency around where we are in our conversations about sexual autonomy and bodily autonomy today, that, to the extent that, this is hubristic idea of what a book can do, but to the extent that I could do anything to help more people be more fluent in what the actual history of this stuff is, maybe that's one more person who can say in the group chat, I think he's getting that history wrong because I just read, or there's like ways to just sort of, or even perhaps more profoundly, there's an intersex or a trans kid or young person who reads my first chapter, which is about this possibly intersex, possibly trans person in the 1620s and outside of colonial Jamestown, the Jamestown settlement, who refused to say that they were either male or female, sort of claimed both male and female. Residents of the community inspected this person's body and reached different conclusions about what the sex of this person was. And it was documented and we know about it and it's there in the historical record. It exists, right? So for someone to say, actually, no, people didn't just invent transgender 10 years ago, right? Like we have stories of female husbands, which a historian, Jen Mannion, has done great work on from the 1700s and 1800s in the, what became the United States and in England, of people who became the married husbands of women, who usually later as a result of death or a medical crisis, people then look at other people outside the marriage, look at this person's body and are like, oh, they don't have a male body. But who were in the meantime living their lives as the husband of their wife. Like the evidence is overwhelming about the existence of all of these people in ways that were unremarkable to many of the people around them until it became a problem.
Well, and what you're also doing in a way is by virtue of the scholarship of finding these documented and right there in front of us examples, reinserting them into a history where they were systematically erased from the narrative. Like it's not that they weren't there. It's that when we have talked about these things, we have not shown that light in that area, just like you were talking about. We have chosen other places to shine. And when I say we, I'm using the royal we, not me, right?
Right.
But
no,
like mainstream history. And I think I'm also hearing a sort of, I wouldn't call it a theme, but kind of an overlay here that your approach, not just to your scholarship and not just to your teaching and not just to your writing, but to your thinking, because I hear it coming out in the conversation and I see it in the book. It's an intersectional approach because that is how the world is, that you cannot extricate a label from a human experience and say, this is the lens, because nobody is just one thing, right?
No,
And
it's
all those
absolutely.
things play off of each other. You cannot not be intersectional, but we have done so much work in academia to try to not be and to try to bucket and label and confine to specific lenses. And that's just not how society works. It's not how psychology works. It's not how humanity works.
No, and I really, I'm glad that that came through. I really tried to do. I approached the book with storytelling, so each chapter is a story. Each chapter is only about a 20-page story. The idea being like, you're not reading this. Most people aren't reading this as an assigned reading for class. The hope is that people will read this because they want to, and giving them a story, giving them something that they can, turn on the bedside light, read a chapter, and then pass out. Kind of a mode. I wanted to make a lot of my points through the examples of the people I was talking about, rather than, saying, the HIV. One of the responses to the HIV/AIDS crisis was the creation of an expansion of chosen family networks, some of which was based in queer culture, some of which came out of Black kinship traditions, and that found family was often part of the survival or the care, in the response to HIV/AIDS. Okay, that's a very dry academic way of saying it, and I don't think I say that at any point in the chapter. And instead, the reader gets to the year 2000, and they're brought to the bedside of someone they've already read a whole lot about, whose life story they now know pretty well. And this bed is surrounded by family and friends who are caring for him in his last days. And so this person who's dying was born in a Japanese incarceration site at Heart Mountain because his parents were Japanese American citizens living in California in the 1940s. And so they were forcibly removed, and he was born at Heart Mountain. And he was both incarcerated for being of Japanese descent. He was later incarcerated for having sex with another boy, and put in juvenile detention. And he didn't need intersectional theory, right? Like, he could face bullies and be like, okay, what is it about me they're responding to? Because there's a couple options, right? And he talked about this in oral histories of like, what actually endangered my life more? Was it that I was Japanese American? Was it that I was queer? And in addition to this, like, his response was to feel solidarity with oppressed people everywhere. And it wasn't about him. It was about the whole system, that of way capitalism supports imperialism, which exploits poor people, which, and so on. He saw it all interconnected. He talked about sexism not just as, putting down women, but also men thinking that they were supposed to be masculine in a particular way. And he
100%.
wanted, So he was like, years before, we're having this whole big conversation about masculinity now, with the whole Tim Walz phenomenon, which I think is good conversation to have. But this guy, his name is Kiyoshi Kuramiya, he was having this conversation in the 70s as part of gay liberation. He was like, guys, we've got to like figure out how to be more flexible in our gender identities and let go of these ideas that we're supposed to be about what a man means. And so, everything for me too, maybe this is getting back to your, where you started about like the water we swim in. That was the water he swam in. He couldn't look at the world and not see all of those things intersecting. And so in my research and the way that I try to approach this history and try to honor the people that I'm writing about, I try to listen to what they're telling me, right? Like, listen to what he's saying about how the world works. And, I can challenge it, I can contextualize it, but allow him to educate me about what his experience was. And rather than me immediately assuming because I've read things that he wrote or things about him that I know what his experience was, and that I found to be a really rewarding way of trying to enliven this history and make it more meaningful to people.
And I think that there is so much power in hearing, from kind of original sources. There's so much power in taking the frame of an individual who is long gone, but who had some form of documentation, some form of physical evidence of their engagement with the world, that stayed. And now we can sort of practice our empathy, not just in this slice of time with the people with whom we bump up against, but actually throughout time. It's such a it's such a gift, I think, to be able to exercise empathy with people from our past and recognize that they weren't black and white. Like they weren't actually um, uh, operating in stop motion. They weren't actually, that's not the right word, but whatever. And how many frames per second? Like we have this tendency to think of historical figures through a lens of simplicity or a lens of folksy whatever, or a lens of they didn't know any better, or no, they were people. Like we could have easily been then and they could have easily been now. And like we're still the same species. We just were in a different society, a different culture. We had different pressures. We had different tools available to us.
And what's so fascinating to see in some of these records is people's own self-presentation or self-understanding change as the context around them changes. So women having intimate relationships with other women was sort of a nothing burger in much of the 1800s. But by the late 1800s and into the early 20th century, there's like psychiatry is starting. There's more theories about deviant sexualities, and that these are the theories of inversion. That a lesbian is a woman who's has her gender flipped internally, and so on. And these are very pathologizing languages, and it starts to become really socially, economically damaging to be publicly known as having your intimate relationships be with other women. And so women who were very out put themselves into the closet. Women who had passionate love affairs talk about how they just burned all their letters from, so there's a lot that's lost. There's this Kathy Kern is another historian who found the story of Winifred Weigel, who's like one of my students go bananas over Winifred Weigel. As one of my students said, like she had her gal pals in every port. She worked for, I think, the YWCA. And so she traveled the world, and she wrote back to her primary partner. This is like early polyamory or something, like her partner in stateside, about how really God wanted her to, she had so much love to give, and like God really wanted her to share that with as many other women as possible. So she was truly fulfilling God's desires for her by having affairs everywhere she went. And my students were like, this, like, she's our hero. Like, this is this completely sexually emancipated, independent woman living her best life in the early 1900s. And when she goes to write her memoir at the end of her life, she completely straightwashes her biography. She writes all of that out of her story. And that's because by the 1950s, it's McCarthyism. It's, if you're gay or lesbian, you will be fired like immediately from your job. If you're in the military, you'll be kicked out. Like there were, all kinds of horrible things happening to gay people in the United States by the period right after World War II. So we even see it within an individual's life, like how they. So another example is Gladys Bentley, who's this fabulous blues singer who performs in a white tux and a top hat until like by the late 30s, she starts performing in evening gowns because it's become more dangerous, to present in the way that she would prefer to do. So you can see it even playing out in the lifetimes of some of these people in the way that they change, or even people who describe toward the end of their lives might describe themselves as like a butch lesbian, but earlier they'd called themselves a stud. And still earlier than that, they might have called themselves a lady lover because, the language around what it meant to be a more masculine woman who loved other women changed. And so the words they used for themselves changed, right? So that even the identities that we sometimes argue over today are really dynamic and really historically specific.
I love it. And I love this fascinating approach to telling the stories of these individuals who in some ways encapsulate certain aspects of our history, but telling those stories of those individuals against the background that they were in at the time, and just kind of bringing that history to life for us. And I think reminding us a little bit that where we are right now is not some foregone conclusion. It's not something that was that was always going to be the outcome of a linear development. That we are who we are because badass people fought to be able to be who we are. And there's always people on the bleeding edge, and there's always people who look at the zeitgeist and go, this is not acceptable for me because it doesn't make room for me, and I'm going to make sure that I make room for myself. And I'm going to do that to hopefully protect space for the people who come after me. And I think that is the most inspiring thing that we can do when we learn from history, is to find our humility and our gratitude for, it's easy, like you said earlier, it's easy to get down on the way that things are right now. And it's easy when we look back at history and go, oh, that was rough. But it's also just as easy to see the humility, to see the gratitude, to find hope in those journeys and those struggles. And I'm really glad that you have presented to us this story about ourselves that so many of us just don't know.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope that lots of people enjoy the stories, because it was the honor of my life to write the book. So I'm
I love
glad
that
it's out
so
in the
much.
world.
Everybody, the book is Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America by Dr. Rebecca L. Davis. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.